Good evening, folks. My name is Michael Sakamoto. I'm the Performing Arts Curator and also the Director of the Asian and Asian American Arts and Culture Program, both at the UMass Fine Arts Center, and it's my deep pleasure to welcome you to an evening with environmental activist, author Bill McKibben, speaking on ecology, culture, and democracy. This evening's event is the last in an annual series of performance, science, art, writing, and other interdisciplinary activities, events, performances, you name it, called Art Sustainability Activism. And our 2023-24 series is called From the Ground Up. The series, the ASA series, is an annual collaboration between the UMass Fine Arts Center, the MFA for Poets and Writers, and the School of Earth and Sustainability. We're all working together to create deliberate opportunities to connect artists, scientists, and change makers. We learn from each other, and together we reckon with climate change, elevating awareness, recognizing climate grief, and catalyzing meaningful change. In addition to our three main partners, ASA 2324 is co-sponsored as well by the UMass Office of the Provost, Orion Magazine, and additional support from Amherst Books, which, if you didn't see them on your way in, please check them out on your way out in the lobby. So please thank you to our co-sponsors. Thank you as well to our Fine Arts Center season sponsors, without whom events such as this in our theaters wouldn't be possible: UMass Hospitality Services, Hotel UMass, and the Massachusetts Cultural Council. Thank you to our sponsors. You can find more info on the annual Art Sustainability Activism series at fineartscenter.com/ASA. And now to introduce our Chancellor, who will also welcome you this evening. A self-described, quote, servant leader, Chancellor Javier Reyes, PhD, became the 31st leader of the University of Massachusetts Amherst on July 1st, 2023, bringing a long and successful career of higher education experience and vision to UMass Amherst. Reyes is an economist who has devoted his career to the cause of public higher education, holding leadership positions at the University of Illinois Chicago, UIC, West Virginia University, and the University of Arkansas. He most recently served as interim chancellor at UIC, Chicago's largest university campus. Born and raised in Mexico, Reyes is the first Hispanic person to serve as chancellor at UMass Amherst. Reyes received his bachelor's degree in economics from the Instituto Tecnológico y de Estudios Superiores de Monterrey, Campus Estado de Mexico, in 1998, and his doctorate in economics from Texas A&M University in 2003. He is actively engaged with the TIAA Diversity Council and the Association of Latino Professionals for America. Marty Meehan, UMass president, has stated, quote, a bold and innovative leader, Javier Reyes has inspired students in the classroom, supported initiatives that have unleashed the teaching and research talents of faculty, and connected great public universities to the socioeconomic aspirations of their communities. Stephen R. Karam, chairman of the UMass Board of Trustees, also states, quote, Chancellor Reyes understands that UMass Amherst is the Commonwealth's indispensable education and research engine. We were determined to find a special leader who could build on all that has been accomplished over the past decade and help drive our flagship campus even higher. We have found that exact person in Dr. Javier Reyes. So please give a warm UMass welcome for Chancellor Javier Reyes.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. But believe me, I'm not the one that should be introduced today, because we have wonderful speaker series today that I think it deserves all your attention. So I'll do what I do best, and is get out of your way as soon as I can, as soon as possible. This is an important thing. When I wanted to bring the perspective a little bit of the university. When you come to a new university like I just did, as you know, I started in July, you get to see a lot of things happening on our campus. You try to see and find key differentiators that provide a university like ours guidance and direction, and you look for those signs in the way, especially as chancellor, as part of the leadership team, that you can follow and continue to support. I would like to say, when you look at the university's strengths in sustainability across the whole campus, this event speaks to that very definition. You can always find sustainability in many ways, in many university campuses where I've been, in areas of how are we operating as a campus and how we're doing our science, how we're advancing the statements and our perspectives as knowledge creators in a university like ours to society, to policymakers. But the beautiful part of this event today is that the Art Sustainability Activism Collaborative, it really represents collaboration with a way that I think it's always needed. When it comes from the arts, when it comes to self-expression, when it comes to a way of creatively articulating something like what we see on the screen that makes the point across, establishes a statement, but it does it in a creative way that engages an audience. To me, that's the beautiful part of how this the Art Sustainability Activism collaboration is really exemplifying the very best of a university like ours, where you bring the whole campus together to talk about and understand a statement like the one that we have on the screen today. I want to applaud all of you for being part of this program. I want to make sure that I thank some of our collaborators that we have today. I want to thank B Fulkerson and the organizers at Third Act, as well as our co-presenters, the good people at Orion magazine, for helping us to put this program today. I want to also acknowledge that the ASA series and the partners that have been producing this annual series since 2019. It's the Fine Arts Center, the School of Earth and Sustainability, and MFA for Poets and Writers. Again, it's an example of how we can bring the very best of a comprehensive university from its science and its arts and its societal, to address a societal challenge like the one that we're facing, and making sure that we do it in a very academic way, but also in a very creative and engaging way to do it. So I want to say thank you to all of you for participating in today's program, and I want to welcome our Third Act member, Joanna Roche, who will introduce Bill McKibben. Thank you very much, and enjoy the event.
Hi, I'm Joanna Roche. I am an actor, writer, dancer, comedian, and I live in Northampton, and I'm old. To put that in context, I'm the same age as Joe Biden. Old. Because we burst onto this planet within days of each other. So, right around our birthdays last year, I started thinking about how old we would be at the end of Joe's second term. The number is daunting, but just in the nick of time, I found out about Third Act. Third Act, you have to be old to get into Third Act, 60 and older. It's for older people who are unwilling to sit around waiting until they croak and want to get shit done right away. So who else but the brilliant writer, author of The End of Nature back in 1989, the man who founded 350.org, the first global grassroots climate organization, and coordinated a planet-scale art project with many of the 20 works visible from satellites. Who else but Bill McKibben would have the vision to figure out that all the hands that are needed on deck right now should include all hands, even old, brittle hands. Biden's are brittle too, but he's taking Pilates to get in shape for when he can sign up for Third Act. And Bill is the visionary who understands that really old people like Joe and me, people who have cell memory of more promising time during the FDR administration, would have a lot to offer. Within Third Act, there are many different working groups, geographic working groups as well as affinity working groups, like lawyers, educators, faith practitioners, retired union members, I am a volunteer co-facilitator of the Creatives Working Group in Third Act. We have writers, actors, musicians, visual artists, digital artists, graphic artists, directors, choreographers, some retired and many still working. We even have an anesthesiologist who is used to putting people to sleep. Now she's waking them up with her painting and her needlework art. And speaking of art, Bill McKibben's work, his life, is a work of art. In 2011 and 2012, Bill led the campaign against the Keystone XL pipeline. In a letter that Bill wrote inviting people to come to Washington, D.C. to protest, he said, quote, "We don't want college-age kids to be the cannon fodder in this fight. They've led the way so far on climate change. Now it's time for people who've spent their lives pouring carbon into the atmosphere and whose careers won't be damaged by an arrest record to step up too." Bill spent 3 days in the D.C. jail, and 2 weeks later, he was inducted into the literature section of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Foreign Policy named him to its inaugural list of the world's 100 most important global thinkers. He is the Schumann Distinguished Scholar at Middlebury College. He's written 20 books and countless articles. His latest book is The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon. He does a deep dive into what went so suddenly sour with American patriotism, American faith, and American prosperity. And then he calls on people of a certain age, us, boomers, the silent generation, even the greatest generation, people who have the skills and the resources to help heal our world. We need to work with young leaders. The young people who've risen to the occasion need our support. Bill's been awarded the Gandhi Peace Prize as well as the Right Livelihood Award for mobilizing and growing popular support in the US and around the world to counter the threat of global climate change. And also, in honor of his work on behalf of the planet, including the insect kingdom, biologists named a new species of woodland gnat in his honor. So when you're walking your dog in the spring and the gnats are flying at your face, do not swat them, because they could be Megophthalmidia McKibbenes. There will be a Q&A after Bill's talk, and Bill will be joined by Third Act's lead national organizer, B Fulkerson. B is a fifth-generation Nevadan raised by a father disabled in the Vietnam War and a peace activist mother, parents who many times bailed B out of jail for getting into good trouble. B's first and second acts were running environmental and progressive groups in Nevada for 34 years. Their third act centers on their grandchildren, the joy of organizing elders, and reimagining the gender binary and other unsatisfactory frameworks. There are many reasons why being part of Third Act is such a joy, and you're about to meet two of them. These at the top set the tone, and Bill and B are pure talent and kindness and caring. Now please welcome Bill McKibben.
Thank you so much, Joanne. That was a truly wonderful introduction, and what a pleasure to get to be here. When the people at UMass and at Orion asked me to come give this talk, I was eager to comply for a couple of reasons. One, I've been coming out to UMass Amherst since I was a boy. I grew up in Massachusetts, and in the summer we'd come out here for academic camp of one kind or another and things, and a pleasure always to be back in this valley and know that this place remains, this institution, the anchor of this remarkable part of the world. In recent years, sort of exemplifying my slightly strange life, I think the last 2 visits I've had to this campus were one to give the commencement address at the business school one year, the management school, and then the next year to come back because my friend Varshini Prakash had dozens of students in jail trying to win and successfully winning divestment from fossil fuels for from UMass's endowment and portfolio, an early victory in what's become the largest anti-corporate campaign in history. I know that UMass is proud of Dr. J and Natalie Cole and a few other great alumni, but I think someday Varshini Prakash may be the single most illustrious person ever to get out of this place. She went on, when she graduated, to form the Sunrise Movement, where she served as its executive director until last month. They were the ones who brought us the Green New Deal. That Green New Deal, once it had gone through the congressional sausage-making machinery, finally became the Inflation Reduction Act, the first thing that Congress has ever done on climate change. Without Varshini, it would not have happened, and without the young people who made that work.
Sorry.
It's not a problem. All good? It's all right.
Yeah.
Good, there you go. And it was a great pleasure, Chancellor Reyes, to get to meet you. It's fun to meet a freshman president on campus. Everybody, of course, is much heartened by UMass's declaration that it would become a zero-carbon campus. And I know that we'll be watching for that kind of leadership all along the next few years. That really puts this campus at the forefront of a lot of work, and good on you. And I'm pretty sure that the next stages of fossil fuel divestment, in this case from the banks and financial institutions, won't require people going to jail again because we're now at a place where it's so abundantly clear what we need to do. And that's really what I'm going to talk about here today. This topic about art and activism is of great interest to me because in a certain sense, my life's work, at least in the last few decades, has been focused around this endlessly interesting question of how we get people to change, how we get societies to change, how we cause change to happen. And as I will say, art is a crucial part of this equation. But before I get there, I need to provide a little bit of backdrop and a couple of caveats to kind of make the case, because climate change, above all, is an eminently practical problem, and it forces a kind of brute realism on one to figure out how we're going to deal with it. 2023 should remind us of that. I wrote the first book about climate change back in 1989, a book called The End of Nature. In those days, we called it the greenhouse effect. We knew then all that we really needed to know and everything we know now, and we were able to predict with great accuracy what was going to happen and when it would happen. Those warnings sadly have gone unheeded, and I've spent much of this year feeling like 2023 was the year that I was really talking about when I wrote The End of Nature. This year has been truly, truly remarkable. The steady warming of the last few decades has taken a huge leap up in the course of the last 8 or 9 months, to the point where in June and July, the scientists told us we were experiencing the hottest weather ever recorded on this planet. Now, those records only go back a couple of hundred years. But scientists, thermometer records, but scientists have a lot of clever proxies for extending that record much further. Ocean cores, ice cores, tree rings, that kind of thing. And so they've been able to say with real confidence that the weather we experienced this Northern Hemisphere summer was the hottest that it's been on planet Earth in at least 125,000 years. That is to say, no human society that we would even begin to recognize has ever dealt with a planet like we're now dealing with. This heat has continued. In September, we blew past this 1.5 degrees Celsius mark that we pledged just 8 years ago in Paris that we would try to avoid. At least for the moment, we're about 1.7 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. And the results of all of this are painfully obvious. I could list them at enormous length, but we hardly need to. Think about this past summer. Those of us in the Northeast spent large parts of it breathing that incredible cloud of smoke that drifted down from Canada, where the forest fires are orders of magnitude larger than they've ever seen before. Canada will produce 2 or 3 times as much carbon from those fires this year than from all the cooking, flying, heating, driving, cooling that Canadians do in the course of a year. It's a vicious feedback cycle, and it's begun to kick in. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That's why we get those droughts that turn into forest fires. But once that water vapor is up in the air, it's going to come down. And when it comes down, it's often in wet places like the Northeast. My home state of Vermont took it on the chin this summer. My town got more rain than any town in Vermont. One of my neighbors a quarter mile away lost his house in a landslide in August. Our capital city, Montpelier, is still a ghost town because every business in town was flooded out. But of course, that doesn't even start to compare with what's happening in the rest of the world. Libya last month had the biggest rainfall in its history, the kind of rainfall you can only have on a globally warmed planet. Before it was done, so much rain had fallen that it washed out 2 dams, and then it washed 10,000 people out to sea where they drowned in an hour. That's the kind of biblical catastrophe that we now see with great regularity around this planet, and that will accelerate no matter what we do in the next few years. But those next few years are crucially important. So here's the first boundary I'm going to put on the use of art in activism. We have to move very fast. This is not like other problems that we're used to dealing with. When I came out to UMass for debate camp as a high school senior, we were taking on the topic across the country of should we have national health care in this country, a question that we've been debating my entire life. Someday we will eventually do it, I imagine, like every other industrialized country in the world. In the meantime, people will die and go bankrupt, but it won't make it harder once we finally get there that we delayed all this time. Climate change isn't like that. Once the Arctic is melted, no one has a good plan for how you're going to freeze it back up again. So, for activists, it does no good to develop some scheme that pays off 25 or 40 or 50 years from now. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us that we have until 2030 to cut emissions in half if we want a chance of meeting those targets we set in Paris. By my watch, 2030 is 6 years and 2 months away. So plans that rely on, say, educating people so that they will grow up and take command of the tools, the reins of power, and run things differently and things aren't going to happen by themselves quickly enough to get this done. The other caveat, or the other boundary is the action that's required is no longer going to be one person at a time. We've passed the point where we can make the math of climate change square, 1 Tesla at a time, 1 vegan dinner at a time. I tell people regularly that the most important thing an individual can do at this point is be somewhat less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to have some chance of changing the economic and political ground rules. the kind of movements that blocked the Keystone Pipeline or brought us that $40 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have divested from fossil fuel. So those caveats, those boundaries inform what I want to say about the uses of art. Those of us who are writers or painters or sculptors or musicians or things are often very committed, as we should be, to following our own particular vision, our own particular muse. And that is important. That's what we are drawn to and best at. But by itself, that's not going to help produce, in the short time that we have, the catalytic changes that we need. So what I'm going to talk about today is art also understood as in service to these movements and to the change that we need to make quickly. And I'm going to talk as if I know what I'm talking about. The truth is, nobody really understands how you build social movements and how you make them work. We make it up as we go along. This is new work. It's really only in the last century that the nonviolent social movement was invented, and it's a strange invention. It came from the margins, from the suffragettes, from Gandhi in India, from Dr. King and all his colleagues in this country. And it shouldn't be a match for the extraordinary power of governments and corporations, but sometimes it is, and sometimes there's a kind of alchemical magic that allows it to become extraordinarily productive, and we can all think of those examples. But we don't really have a good sense of how it works. We have West Point and institutions like it all over the world to study how force works, and we're pretty good at figuring that out, but we don't really have a good sense of how movements produce change. And I will tell you that when I began this work, I was utterly clueless. I wrote the first book about all this, and for 10 or 12 years, I thought that was continuing to write about it, was just what I did, was my role in this battle. It took me a while to realize that I had made a mistake in that. Writers, academics, tend to think of the world as a series of arguments, and that the job is to win those arguments and compile enough evidence and so on to carry the day. It took me a while to understand that we had won the argument about climate change. The science was crystal clear, and there was a big global consensus behind it. We'd won the argument. We were just losing the fight, because the fight wasn't about evidence and data. The fight was what fights are always about: money and power. And the other side, in this case the fossil fuel industry, possessed so much money and had so much political power that it was able to lose the argument but continue merrily on its way with its business model, filling the atmosphere with carbon. So we needed to build some power of our own, lacking billions of dollars. The only alternative that history suggests is the currency of movements: passion, spirit, creativity, sometimes the willingness to spend one's body and go to jail. And so we set to work. I live in the end of a dirt road in Vermont, which is not a very promising place from which to try and shift the world. And I had no idea what I was doing. I'd come back from a trip to Bangladesh, inspired again to do more work. And the first thing I did was call up writer friends of mine in Vermont. This was 20 years ago. We said, hey, let's go up to the federal building in Burlington, which is our main city. It's only 50,000 people, so not much of a city, but it's what we've got. We'll go to the federal building and we'll sit in and we'll get arrested, and there'll be a story in the paper, and at least we will have done something. And all the other writer friends as clueless, oh, that's a good idea, let's do that. But happily, one of them was wise enough to call up to the police in Burlington and say, what will happen if we do this? And the police said, nothing will happen. Stay there as long as you want. So we were forced to recalibrate, and we instead took a march. We walked for 5 days up the western edge. We started at Robert Frost's old summer writing cabin, because he's kind of our patron saint in Vermont. And we slept in farm fields. I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher, so I'd called up the churches along the way to make sure that there would be potluck suppers. The sort of Methodist sacrament would be available each evening as we walked. And by the time we got to Burlington, there were 1,000 people. Now, for those of you in cosmopolitan Amherst, 1,000 people doesn't sound like much. But in Vermont, with the possible exception of UVM hockey games, that's as big a crowd as ever assembles for anything. And so we felt okay until we read the paper the next morning, and there was a story that said this 1,000 people that had gathered in Vermont was probably the biggest demonstration that had yet taken place in the United States about climate change. This was 2006. I read that and thought, no wonder we're losing. We've got the superstructure of a movement. We've got scientists, policy people. We've got Al Gore. The only part of the movement we left out was the movement part. There's nobody there to make this work. Let's go to work. One of the good things about walking all those days is that you have plenty of time to talk. And as we walked and talked, I started broaching an idea with the mostly young people that we were walking with. Remember, 2006 was the early days of the internet, but I was convinced that we had reached the point where it was just possible to imagine doing a kind of globally distributed day of action that would begin to use the surface of the earth as a kind of canvas for what was essentially a large-scale work of performance art, of people beginning to demonstrate their concern for things. We tried it first in the US, and these are pictures from that first effort. We called it Step It Up. And back then, 20 years ago, it was a very radical demand to cut carbon 80% by 2050. We didn't know that science would force us in the direction of net zero as time went on. So that's the message you'll see. And you'll see people creating not fine art, but art of a kind, often with their bodies. There they are by their thousands in front of the Capitol. There they are in a part of a big demonstration along the Battery in New York, reminding people that it's 4 or 5 feet above sea level there at the Battery, and among the most valuable real estate on planet Earth. There's people on the beach in California, I think, and there's people on the levees in New Orleans. This would have been just pre-Katrina, I think. That's a carbon footprint. But it was a beautiful, beautiful day of action, and people were beginning to bring a kind of artistic sensibility to bear. And within 3 days of this day of action that we did, both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, then running for president in the Democratic primary, had embraced this heretofore radical notion of 80% cuts in carbon by 2050. It heartened us to see what else we could do. When I say us, I mean myself and 7 undergraduates at Middlebury. So we went on to form 350.org, which took its name from what the scientists told us was the most carbon we could safely have in the atmosphere, 350 parts per million. One of the reasons we took that name was because we knew we needed to work around the world. They don't call it global warming for nothing. And we figured that Arabic numerals would translate more easily than English words. And so it became. The first big day of action we did at 350.org, we put out the call to people around the world to try and do what we could. There were 7 students working on this. There are 7 continents. Each one took one. The guy who took the Antarctic also had to take the internet. We fanned out across the globe, often by telephone, but also by airplane and boat and everything else, trying to find people who shared our concern, and we found them everywhere. And of course, in many places, they had to be much braver than we had been in the United States. I'm going to show you this picture less because it's artistic than because it demonstrates the incredible courage that people brought to these fights, and some of the incredible gulfs that we're still trying hard to bridge. We'd set this big day of action for a Saturday. On Thursday, the satellite phone rang in the little one-room office that we had, and it was our organizers in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, who, like most of us then, were women, and like a surprising number of us were in this case 17 and 16. And one of those two sisters was on the phone, and she was in tears. She said, the government took away our permit for Saturday, so we're going to do this today before they can stop us. And we're so sorry. We don't mean to spoil it for everybody. We so wanted to do it with everybody else. We hope we're not wrecking it by jumping the gun. And we have 10,000 people out in the street in Addis Ababa right now chanting 350. So I was like, Lloyd, do not worry about the date. It's okay. What we need is a picture right away, because this is fantastic, and we want to be able to show it around the world. And she said, you know, the internet's not really working today in Ethiopia. It's going to be hard. We were like, oh, what do we do? So I don't think we had Google yet, but I started messing around in the computer and discovered that there was one Western hotel in Addis Ababa. There's an Intercontinental. And I said, they have internet in the lobby. Take your phone in there, press the button, and send us the picture. She called back half an hour later, and again she was in tears, and she said, they won't let me in the lobby. They say it's not really for Africans. And I said, this is not good, and here's what we're going to have to do for the moment. I knew that a lot of the people staying in that hotel were Westerners who'd gone there to adopt children. I said, just want you to stand there until you see a nice-looking white lady coming in the door, and you hand her your phone and tell her to go inside and press the button. And that's what she did. And 20 minutes later, we had this photo, which we got out around the world, and it was an incredibly important sort of scene setter for that day. It got journalists everywhere interested. The fact that 10,000 Ethiopian school kids were marching around climate change in 2008 was a remarkable thing. But it also was a reminder of the unbelievable gulfs that we're working with all around the world. It was also the prelude to what turned into a remarkable weekend. Before it was over, there had been 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. And it was beautiful. It was our conception of a kind of planet as canvas, lighting up from every direction. Our killer app was Flickr. Facebook and Twitter weren't really things yet, but there was this photo sharing website called Flickr. So we were telling people, upload pictures the second you have them. And my job was watching those come in and sending them out to journalists, and we'd rented out one of those billboards at the end of Times Square that's normally vodka ads and things, and we were showing these photos as they came up. And they were coming in 10 and 20 a minute sometimes from around the world. And one of the things that I realized right away, is almost a kind of revelation. I'd spent my life hearing people tell me that environmentalism was something that rich white people did. And if you didn't know where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be an environmentalist, and on and on and on. It took 10 minutes to figure out that almost everybody we were working with around the world was poor, black, brown, Asian, young, because almost everybody in the world falls into those categories. And what do you know? They care exactly as much about the future as anybody in this room, maybe more so, because the future bears down awfully hard on you in those places. But we also realized that people had an extraordinary genius for kind of figuring out clever, beautiful ways to get these messages across in every possible form. And the pictures were just, I could just show them to you. We have 5,100 of them. I could show them to you all night, and they're each one more beautiful than the next and filled with meaning. I told you that I'd started this project because I'd been to Bangladesh watching people die of dengue fever. So I was extraordinarily moved to see pictures coming in by the dozens from different rallies in Dhaka and Cox's Bazar and every place else in that most beautiful of countries. But people were funny. people were committed. There were 200 demonstrations in China that day. Even then, it wasn't easy to do that in China. You couldn't do it today. You'd be tossed in jail in a second. But it was really profound to see, especially young people pushing hard on the Chinese government. But everywhere, just people figuring out ways to make things that were beautiful and funny and profound. There's the Student Government Association of the Maldives holding their meeting in the lagoon to demonstrate the existential problem that comes with living in an archipelago where the highest point above sea level is 2 meters. People have lived there for 5,000 years, but the odds that they make it through this century are slim to none, you know, and it was, but their slogan is, you know, we're fighting. And so it was beautiful and moving to see. I mean, those girls, you know, I mean, that picture haunts me to this day because those girls are likely to be refugees in their lifetime, and not from anything they did, from stuff we did. But people, as I say, brought their A game, and there were beautiful, beautiful images flooding in from everywhere. This one I show because we've just come through, obviously, a hideous and traumatic week in the Middle East. I'd been to Bethlehem to do some organizing. Even then, there were too many military barriers to really allow people to effectively get back and forth to cross, but there were people everywhere who wanted to do this. So the Jordanians said, we'll make a big 3 on our beach, and the Palestinians said, we'll take care of the 5, and the Israelis said, we'll make the 0 on the beach at Tel Aviv. And this picture was shown all over that part of the world all weekend because it was a pretty rare example of people figuring out how to come together to cooperate. And I've been looking at it this week just to kind of rekindle any hope one might have that we'll be able to figure it out. But there were, you know, clever iterations of all kinds. That's the Syracuse football field with 100,000 people watching. That's Boston building a wall against the rising tide. That's Middlebury, where I live, with the rock climbers up on the wall doing some interesting time-lapse things. That was at the height of the intervention, the war in Iraq. A bunch of people started out. They had to go through 6 military checkpoints to get to this place. They wanted to take their photo. There was only one woman who was brave enough to keep going through them all. But when she got there, she took that picture, and believe me, we cried when it, you know, showed up in the computer because we knew what it meant. But then there, you know, from the sublime to the slightly ridiculous, golf carts in the, you know, verdant hills of California. Beautiful pictures from, you know, Buddhist monasteries. There's a lot of this aerial art that people were figuring out how to do with thousands of bodies, that in Aspen. We had a file of 500 pictures that was just labeled 350 adorable. They were adorable, and they helped get the message across. There's that crew of young people delivering all these pictures to the UN the next week. We went on to do all kinds of things. One of them Joanna mentioned was this massive art, what we called the world's biggest art project that kind of grew out of this. And we did these images that were so big you needed satellites to see them. Tom York from Radiohead assembled this one, handing out blue raincoats to a few thousand of his closest friends. That's the image of, for the classically educated among you, of King Canute trying to hold back the rising tide. That's an image from Santo Domingo, again, with thousands of people illustrating something that's much too common now on this planet, people having to flee out the roof of their house as floods come in the first floor. That scarab beetle is pushing thousands of solar panels across the Egyptian desert. That's obviously a polar bear up a big one. But here's my very favorite. This is from the one of those now dry riverbeds in the Southwest. And when the satellite went over, a couple of thousand people assembled by the Santa Fe Art Institute put blue sheets and blankets up overhead just to bring that river back to life for a minute. That poignant and powerful sense of what we might be able to do. I could, again, show you pictures all day, but let me just give you a couple more images to kind of illustrate some of the themes that we've been trying to talk about. 2014, we had a great march in New York, and there were 400,000 people in the street. In some ways, a high point of the whole climate movement. But while we were doing that in New York, our great colleagues in the Pacific, 350 in the Pacific was called Pacific Climate Warriors, and they are great. They're on those islands, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, the Solomons, the Marshalls, that may not exist much longer, but their slogan is, "We're not drowning, we're fighting." They built, you see that canoe in the middle. On each of the islands, they built a traditional war canoe, and then they took them to their neighboring island of Australia and used them for a day to blockade the biggest coal port in the world, which is in Newcastle. And it was a beautiful demonstration about indigenous power, but it was also an illustration of one of the great tropes that kind of exists in the human mind, I think, and it's really important. The trope of the small and the many standing up to the mighty and the few. Those are the biggest ore ships in the world, and they're being held in the harbor for a day by this collection of thousands of people in canoes and kayaks. I don't know if you'd exactly call it art, but I would. It strikes me as performance art of the highest order, illustrating a kind of deep, emotional, and powerful truth about where we need to be. So that brings me up to the present, and I'm going to talk for a minute and for the young people, students in here. File this under Tell Your Grandparents About It. This is this work we're doing now at Third Act, which we're coming up on our second anniversary. And it's been beautiful, beautiful organizing, and many of the people in this room are involved, and such thanks for it. You'll meet our lead organizer, B Fulkerson, in a minute. But Third Act organizes people over 60 for action on climate and democracy, because we think they're the interlinked crisis of our moment. From the beginning, we've thought about the aesthetic. If you look at that typeface, I'm just going to talk about it for a second, but it was the very first decision that we made. An old friend of mine is a great logo designer. He designed the logo for Spotify and for Dropbox. He was a classmate of mine at Lexington High School almost 50 years ago. And he volunteered to help right away. And we were sitting around looking at typefaces, and one of those typefaces was labeled, the name of it was Bayard, B-A-Y-A-R-D, and I saw it and immediately thought it must somehow be connected to one of my great heroes, Bayard Rustin, the organizer who was really the genius behind the March on Washington in 1963. Wasn't allowed to speak at the march because he was gay, and they were terrified that that would reflect badly on the movement in an earlier age, but he was the one who made it work. It turns out that indeed that's who this typeface was named for. A young African-American typographer had just created it, and he did it based on the lettering of signs on the March on Washington in 1963. So that became not only a beautiful typeface, but one that spoke very much to the history that we're trying to conjure at Third Act, because of course people in their 60s and 70s and 80s now were the people who were around then to do the extraordinary work required in those days to transform our society. My fellow board member, Heather Booth, she went south with that first wave of Freedom Riders in the summer of 1964 to register voters in Mississippi. When she came back, she set up the first women's health network that provided abortions illegally for people in the years before Roe v. Wade. So we've been at it a very long time, and we wanted to get that across. And it's been extraordinary work, and some of the art is just exactly what you would expect, the kind of very beautiful fine art exemplified by those quilts. These are from Nevada, where we did a tremendous job under B's leadership of turning out the vote to make sure that that crucial Senate seat stayed in the right hands in the last election, and really it turned out to be the deciding vote in the U.S. Senate. And I love the kind of work that people have been doing. But we also are figuring out how to effectively ally ourselves with, support the young people who have been at the focus of all this work. This was the picture of the very first demonstration we ever did, really before we'd officially formed, back in Boston. And we were going to, following a crowd of young people to these banks. They'd asked us to come along, the banks, Citibank, Chase Bank, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, that are the 4 biggest lenders to the fossil fuel industry. And the key sign here was the one you can see in the background, Fossils Against Fossil Fuels. Every kid who saw it started laughing and came up to, high five everybody. There was none of that okay boomer stuff that day, because people understood that they were being supported, and supported not arrogantly, but in the right way. And that's become my personal slogan ever since. Beautiful, beautiful artwork of all kinds has come out of this as we've organized. And especially this spring, when we organized this huge day of action, 100 demonstrations in 100 cities about those banks. This was the sort of back to the streets moment for the climate movement after the pandemic. And it was great fun all across the country. And a lot of it was remarkable art, facilitated by one of the most remarkable Americans I know, a man named David Solnit, who works out of the Bay Area. You probably know his sister, my old and dear friend Rebecca Solnit, who's the best essayist at work in the English language right now. But David, her brother, his talent is what you might call public art, figuring out how to organize and train people to be able to produce beautiful stuff that's of great use going forward. There he is. And so all around the country we were doing these art builds and figuring out how to get messages out in ways that would really stick in people's minds. And they really, really were beautiful. The scissors are because we were cutting up credit cards left and right. But there was all kinds of art. There are the presidents, CEOs of those banks, and people were doing things like figuring out how to put their grandchildren into the mix, show who they were fighting for. And there were the most beautiful images appearing everywhere, on placards, but also on the streets, because David is expert at figuring out how to help people do that kind of thing too. I was in DC for that day of action, and there were thousands and thousands of people out in the streets led by Third Act, and it was beautiful. And we shut the banks down for the day with sit-ins. We're too old, some of us, to any longer think of sprawling on the concrete sidewalk for 4 or 5 hours as a pleasurable activity. So instead, what we did was, go ahead here just a little bit, what we did was round up hundreds of rocking chairs from all the goodwill in the greater DC area, and that's how it was the most comfortable sit-in I've ever taken part in my entire life. We shut the banks down for the day, and everybody noticed because of that piece of art, and that's what it was. It got across this message, and you could tell because the New York Times the next day was all about the rocking chair rebellion, and so was the Washington Post, and so was everywhere else. That's what art, an artistic spark of a certain kind, can do. It can begin to make these deep and interesting emotional connections that allow people to understand things in a slightly new and different way. And I think nothing could be more important to the work we need to do going forward. There's my mother, 93, out for the day, and her... I'm going to close with just a couple of other images. These from a more directly inspired art project that I put together a few years ago. There was a poet, a wonderful poet named Kathy Jetnil Kajiner, who I've known for many years. A young woman, she comes from the Marshall Islands. And I'd long wanted to have her do a poem standing on top of the ice sheet in Greenland that when it melted would drown her home. I wanted a way to really magnify for people the impact of her words so that they would be more than words, there'd also be an image to go with it. So we organized this expedition to Greenland. That's the boat on the way to the ice sheet. I was back in the wheelhouse for a little while and looked up with some alarm to note that I don't know if you can quite see it, but the teardrop-shaped black cursor that indicates where the boat is was clearly indicating that it was a mile or so on dry land. And when I pointed it out to the captain, he laughed and said, "Oh, the chart is, 5 years old. That's all open water now, So Kathy on the left recruited Akaniviana, a young Greenlandic poet, and together we hiked for days up to the very top of this ice sheet and shot this amazing video of them reciting this poem that we turned into a video, wonderful production team that's been seen many millions of times on YouTube and things, but it was very powerful, very beautiful. But on the way back, when we were leaving via helicopter to get off the ice sheet, we were reminded that in some other way, nature itself is now producing the most extravagant, powerful, remarkable pieces of art that we can imagine. If you think about it in one way, those great fires in Canada are another piece of performance art, of the planet trying to explain what's going on. And so are 1,000 other phenomena. Let's see if I can get this to work. I was just shooting this with my cell phone camera, and it takes a minute to get to the payoff, so you can just enjoy a little view over a little bit of the green that you occasionally find along the fjords in Greenland. And you can see the massive icebergs down at the fjord. And we need to remember always what an unbelievably beautiful planet we still inhabit. And we need to be able to pay witness to that planet. And we need to be able to understand always the forces that we have now unleashed, their scale, their momentum, their power. That's looking up the glacier towards the huge ice sheet, the front of that, which, covers tens of thousands of square miles, and the front of it's about the height of a 20-story building. So think of the library here on campus, And as we were flying over, something happened that happens every second of every minute of every hour of every day now, someplace on the planet, and we just happened to be here to witness this particular moment. Look at that. Keep your eye on that one extension of this ice sheet there as it begins suddenly to collapse into the ocean beneath us, and those waves were 40 and 50 feet high. The pilot kind of wanted to leave, but I, of course, was like, no, circle, this is, we want to capture this. It's of sublime beauty, and it also means that the ocean is now some tiny fraction of a millimeter higher, and as that happens every second of every minute of every hour, the earth that we live on changes and becomes harder and harder and harder to exist upon. Our job, and here I will end, is just to, as quickly as we can, use every resource that we have within us to figure out how to slow that process down and give us some chance. Great scientists and great engineers are doing their part. They've dropped the price of a solar panel 90% in the last decade. That is a miracle. It is a great gift. But by itself, it is not closing the gap fast enough. Environmentalists have been wonderful at appealing to whichever hemisphere of the human brain it is that likes bar graphs and pie charts, but we also need to figure out how to appeal to the part of the human imagination that reacts viscerally and emotionally to the world around us. And that is what art of all kinds can do. But art in particular right now that subordinates some of its personal, idiosyncratic, individual vision for the task of figuring out how to unite us quickly for the single biggest task that human beings have ever faced. Thank you all very much. Here you are. And now we can go over. You can sit down. Do you have a microphone? Oh, I think there's one over there already. And this is my great colleague, B Fulkerson, who is the man responsible for Third Act growing the way that it has grown. No. And now we're going to recline, because we're very old and it's hard for us to stand up for long periods of time. So that's why we're sitting down.
Feels good. And thanks so much, everybody, and thanks, Bill, for that. Thanks to those of you who filled out the question cards. We'll try to get through them, as many as we can. The first one is from a Sunrise chapter here on campus, Bill, and they ask, on a college campus level, how do we get other students who are already busy and stressed to care about the climate crisis in a way that inspires action through hope?
Well, it's no different for young people, college students, older people, anybody else. It has to be in some level connect emotionally with people to get them engaged. Now, there have been periods of campus activism over American history when that emotional connection was super easy. Like there's a draft going on and you might have to go to Vietnam, so that's no big surprise that you were able to rouse people to, political action. Somehow we have to be able to keep reminding ourselves that we're in a situation at least that dire. And people on campuses have figured out lots of ways to do that over the years. In the course of this divestment thing, on college campuses, one place or another, they've done things like build shanty towns like the ones that people have had to move to as their homes have flooded, and lived in them for a week or two or three to try and illustrate to people what's going on, so on and so forth. And often one of the best assets on a cosmopolitan global campus like this is bringing together students and faculty from places that are truly, truly in the early crosshairs of climate change. I mean, by this point, everybody's beginning to feel it, even places we thought of as kind of a refuge like Vermont. But there's no question that the iron law of global warming is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get hit. And this campus is filled with people from places that are getting hit and hit hard. Think about, say, Pakistan, which last year had the greatest flooding since Noah on this planet. Rainfall so hard that a third of the country was underwater. 30 million people out of their homes. That's like everybody from Boston to Baltimore having to pick up and move for a while. There's still people dying of cholera and all the things that come with dirty water and things in the wake of that flooding. Well, figure out how to get some of those students to tell their stories to others, to bring this home. There's a lot of ways to try and dramatize it. And I think one of the things that probably is underway here is at many campuses now is this effort to make people understand what the big banks are doing and try and convince, we're doing this at our campus, trying to convince the college to switch its accounts away from these big banks towards ones that are a little less damaging. There's some great opportunities to do that right now. Citibank and Chase are underwriting this massive expansion of liquefied natural gas ports along the Gulf Coast that mean that the U.S. is the single fastest expanding source of carbon emissions in the world now, because we're exporting all this stuff around the world. In the process, we're destroying poor communities of color along the Gulf, and so it's an excellent opportunity to try and illustrate for people just what's going on. There's a lot of good occasions, and you will figure them out. And I'm hopeful. That it won't have to be a kind of repeat of what happened with when Varshini Prakash was first raising these issues here on this campus, because there's no good reason that anybody should have to go to jail about all this. I've ended up in handcuffs a dozen times now, and each time I feel more ridiculous than the time before. Like, why are we going to jail to get people to understand physics? It seems but sometimes you have to, and that in itself, obviously, is another kind of performance art. At least that's one of the things that it is, and so we will keep at it.
Thank you. Today we did this workshop here thanks to the Arts, Activism, Sustainability program here at UMass Amherst, and the leaders from Third Act Mass, George, and Marjorie, who are here in the audience today, and many others from Third Act came from Rhode Island, from Connecticut, from Massachusetts. And one of the things that attracted me to Third Act was the working principles, and we went over those working principles today. And one of those working principles that you wrote was back up the youths. Back up the youths. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely.
Especially, yeah.
Absolutely, and it's thank you, B, for. Look, I've spent my lifetime working on this, and most of that's been with young people. It was those 7 college students that I started 350 with, then all the young people everywhere like Varshini that figured out how to do this divestment stuff on one campus after another, to the point where, now Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge and Princeton and University of California and the University of Michigan and pretty much anything else you could name has divested. UMass was early at this, and many thanks for the people who helped that happen. And then there was the Sunrise movement that I described. And then, of course, around the world, there was the amazing Fridays for the Future movement that Greta Thunberg kicked off. She's one of my favorite people to work with on earth. I adore her. It was so much fun to get to write her a congratulatory message in June on her graduation from high school, okay? That's fantastic. But I've heard one too many people say, it's up to the next generation to solve these problems, which is A, ignoble, and B, highly impractical. For all their energy, intelligence, and idealism, young people lack the structural power to make by themselves change on the scale that we need in the time that we have. They need support. Who has structural power? I think my formula now is, if you have hair coming out your ears, you also have structural power coming out your ears, okay? Those of us of a certain age, there's 70 million people over the age of 60 in this country. That's larger than the population of France. We punch way above our weight because we all vote. There is no known way to stop old people from voting. And we ended up with most of the money. We've got 70% of the country's financial assets. So if you want to kick Wall Street or Washington or Beacon Hill in the shins a little bit, having a few people with hairlines like mine is a useful asset. And the old idea was that older people become more conservative as they age. I don't know whether that's always been true, but it's why people haven't tried to do this kind of organizing before. It's not true for this group. If you're, as I said before, if you're in your 60s and 70s and 80s now, your first act was this moment of great social, cultural, political transformation. It's when we started taking women seriously in public life. It's the apex of the civil rights movement. It's the first Earth Day in 1970 when 20 million Americans, 10% of the then population, were in the streets. I have no doubt that this campus was absolutely filled with people on April 22nd, 1970, who were figuring out 1,000 creative ways, and in the process, within a year, had won the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, on and on and on. Look, you could make the argument that our second act might have been a little bit more about consumerism than citizenship, taken as a whole, with plenty of noble exceptions. But that's water under the bridge, and now people are at this age when they have resources and time and connections and skills and can really go to work. And the fun of that work is figuring out how to back up young people who are doing so much of the leading. That's why we got into banks. It's because Fridays for the Future said, we want to take on these banks, but most of us are too young to have a checking account, you know? Can you give some help? And we're like, sure. I don't know, I don't know whether, you've spent as much time as I have now thinking this all through. One of the things that strikes me, the sort of secret lesson here, is that it's actually much easier for people to work across the age gap between sort of age of grandchildren and grandparents than it is parents and children. Like, all grandparents love their grandchildren unconditionally, no matter what nonsense they're up to. And all grandchildren are wise enough to cut their grandparents some slack, you know, that they would not cut their parents under any circumstances, you know. So it's actually a beautiful, remarkably easy and graceful place to work, and we're having a great amount of fun sort of figuring it out, I think.
Yeah. Today at that workshop, one of the best campaigners in the country who works for Third Act, our colleague Jeremy Friedman, led a session on what's happening with Third Act campaigns on banks and democracy. And you just got back from Maine doing a session up there. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening in the Northeast, what's happening in Maine with respect to those campaigns?
Right. Well, you know, we're all obviously gearing up for 2024 in one way or another. I mean, I'm getting a little tired of this is the most important election of your lifetime, but this one's probably going to be the most important election of our lifetimes. And so this November, there's not many elections, but the ones that exist, we're honing our skills. There's incredible work being done in Virginia ahead of their very important legislative elections. But in Maine, where I just was, there's an item on the ballot that would take their two bad private utilities and replace them with a public utility, Pine Tree Power. And this initiative is being led by wonderful young people who have done extraordinary work, but it's been really fun to pull Third Act Maine in behind them. We had a rally on Saturday night at a church in downtown Portland, and there were 200 people our age there listening to the young people and to me speak, and then signing up to do all the work over the next 2 or 3 weeks of getting out the vote, and we're mobilizing phone banks from around the country to help and things like that. We may not win that fight. The utilities are outspending those young people 32-1. Reminder that Citizens United was one of the true blows to the body of our body politic that there ever was. But they're giving one hell of a fight, and it's building great muscle and cooperation and solidarity. So the same kind of thing. Next year is going to be all out because we're out of time. We've run out of years. There's no more spare years on the climate stuff. This stuff is now happening in real time. And if we don't make massive changes every year from now on out, we have no chance of even beginning to catch up with the physics of climate change. And next year is this fateful election when it's entirely possible that at the moment, the guy who's leading the polls in that presidential election has more or less said he'll use his term to cancel democracy and exercise vengeance from all his perceived enemies. I mean, we barely got him out the door the last time without after his attempted coup. So we've got a ton of work, and it's going to take all of us, and it may especially take some. This is one place where older people, I think, can be really helpful. If you're 20 right now, your effective, knowledge of your N of presidents is 2, okay? That's how many presidents you've experienced, really, in your conscious life. So you know that Trump was bad, but maybe you don't have quite the same sense that those of us of a certain age do, that he is entirely unlike anything that we've seen before. Like, we've seen Richard Nixon. He was, a corrupt and unpleasant fellow, but he wasn't a maniac, So I think that historical perspective is going to be really helpful and really important next year as we do this work. In the same way that the historical perspective, and it's very sad, around climate is kind of helpful too. I mean, I remember when winter was winter and deep, and I'm at this latitude, and I mourn for it I live at 1,500 feet in Vermont. It's October 16th, and we have not had a frost yet or anything close to it. That's not normal, So that historical sense is, I think, a useful gift in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and with that, and there's several questions about this. I'll try and boil down into this, but with that historical sense also comes a lot of grief and a lot of sadness and a lot of anguish. And the question is, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with your grief? How do you deal with your sadness, your anguish about what is happening and what's to come?
Well, I've had a lot of practice, so that helps. But it's been a long time that I've been working on it. But it doesn't really help. My daughter is pregnant with who'll be our first grandchild. And I'm extraordinarily happy about that. And the day she told us that she was pregnant was also the day that my friend Jim Hansen, the great climate scientist, called me to say this is the hottest day in 125,000 years on this planet. So you can imagine that my constellation of emotions was up and down. It is hard to contemplate what the world will be like in 80 years for that child, and it gives you more incentive to do it, to do the work. I think this may be another place where there are certain advantages to being closer to the exit than the entrance. Somehow it makes it emotionally. I don't really quite have the words for it, but we should be able to summon up the kind of courage to act very forthrightly. It's a lot harder being 18 right now because you're staring down the barrel of a lifetime of this, I'm going to be dead before the absolute worst of it hits, and that, in a certain way, is psychologically empowering to let one go to work. In the most general terms, in my experience, the best way to deal with grief and anxiety is to go to work on this stuff and figure out some place that feels big enough to bother digging in. And that's what I was saying earlier about, the most important thing an individual can do is be less of an individual. Find other people to dig in with. That's why we formed 350.org. It's why we formed Third Act. It's why Varshini and others formed the Sunrise Movement, so that you can plausibly tell yourself and the world that you are doing things on a scale that might actually matter in the course of this, because that's what it demands.
Yeah. And then when you talk about third act and how we're trying to get elders involved, what you say sometimes we have to go fast by going slow.
You talk about that, 'cause you talk
as
beautifully
old
about
people,
that.
well, I used to have this attitude, the world's burning down, my hair is on fire, we don't have time to be kind, we have to like use every expletive in the book and go yell at buildings and yell at politicians and get out there as quickly as possible. And at third act, you and Akaya Winwood, our lead national advisor, people like Rebecca Solnit, who's a student of Roshi Joan Halifax, who says to be calm is an act of resistance. All that stuff is coming to me now in my later years as an organizer. It's comforting, but yet we don't have a lot of time.
Yeah, so you guys are all, Westerners. I'm a, hopelessly Puritan New Englander, and I'm like, yeah, no, we just got to do the work fast and hard right now, kick it into gear. But I'm glad that there are people who are smart enough to understand that it's that there is, we have to move gracefully and elegantly and together. That doesn't mean we don't go fierce and hard too, when that's required. And Joanna read that letter. We have to stop. We're at 7:30, so I'll just finish by saying, Joanna read that letter that I wrote when we were starting the Keystone stuff. I wrote the letter asking people to come to Washington and get arrested, and it must have been a reasonably good letter, because it was the largest civil disobedience action there's been in this country in many years about anything. About 1,250 people went to jail over 2 weeks. But she read the key sentence for me, which was, this is a case where young people shouldn't have to be the cannon fodder. They're doing most of the work, but if you're 18, an arrest record may not be the absolute best thing for your resume. One of the few unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you, And so it was with pleasure that we watched a lot of people, whose hair had turned gray, arrive in D.C. Now, we did not ask people as they were getting arrested, how old are you? Because that would be rude, and we're well brought up. But we did, cleverly, I think, say to people, who was president when you were born? And the two biggest cohorts were from the FDR and the Truman administrations. On the last day, there was a guy arrested with a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, handle with care. He was old enough that he'd been born in the Warren Harding administration, which, frankly, I'd essentially forgotten there was a Warren Harding administration. It was beautiful, because there were a lot of young people there, and they got to see elders behaving the way that we actually need elders behaving in a working society. I don't mean necessarily getting arrested, though I'm always amazed by the number of people who tell me that it's on their bucket list, and if it's on yours, we can definitely help with the process. But I mean the planet is outside its comfort zone, so we got to be outside our comfort zone, no matter how old we are, and your comfort zone probably shrinks as you get older, but that's all right. We figure out ways to kick against it and to do what we can. And it's beautiful work that we do not knowing whether we will win or not. Dr. King, my particular hero of American heroes, always ended his talks by quoting from the Massachusetts abolitionist Theodore Parker. And he would say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. which is a very comforting thought. It means, I think, this may take a while, but we're going to win. The arc of the physical universe is short, and it bends toward heat. And if we don't win soon, then we do not win. So we might as well give it what we've got while we're here. That's the point of third act and of a lot of other stuff. So many thanks, man.
Thank you, Bill McKibben. Thanks to all of you.